Hi, this is Scott from SaaS Startup Stories, and today's show is sponsored by ActiveCampaign, the world's #1 email marketing and automation platform, and the system that I use to run my entire business. If you'd like to get started with ActiveCampaign and get your first 2 months for free, then go to scottdudley.com/AC and fill out the form. And pretty excited today because my special guest is Andrew Michael. Andrew's based in Cyprus and is the founder and CEO at Avrio, which is a collaborative research platform that transforms customer conversations and data highlights into actionable insights. Andrew, you ready to rock and roll?
I'm ready. Thanks for the invite, Scott.
No worries. All right, so let's get started then. Talk a little bit about your background and what initially got you interested in starting a SaaS company.
Yeah. So from my background, I've always been a startup founder to some degree, working in the software space. One of the first startups I did when I was around like 19 or 20 years old was I was out here in Cyprus. We built an online shopping mall when you could create your first online store in a matter of minutes, and then you could start accepting payments. And this was actually a very, very early stage. Like this is when Shopify still wasn't really a thing back then. And I made the big mistake of really focusing on the wrong market and just really thinking that Cyprus was going to be the place to be able to launch something like this. But all throughout my career, I've been in software space, and what really attracted me was I actually remember the first night this business, I went to bed, I woke up in the morning and there was 200 euros in the bank account, and I was like, wow. I was sleeping and I was making money. And that sort of was the light bulb moment, I think, when, I really need to learn about the space, really need to learn and understand. And then the next thing, just SaaS, I really love the predictability about it to some degree. When you get to a certain level in your metrics and understanding and your growth channels, you can really start to understand the different levers and how you can influence them through different actions you take. So I feel like as far as business models goes, it tends to be one of the more predictable models that you can understand, okay, what's growth going to look like over the next year? And then you can actually start planning for it a lot more effectively than most traditional businesses would.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. All right. So did you borrow VC money to launch Avrio, or did you bootstrap it instead? Tell us a little bit about how you got it off the ground.
Yeah, so Avrio actually started as a pain point that faced personally. Previously, I was head of business intelligence at Hotjar, and sort of saw as the company grew, customer research can be a little bit more and more siloed. We weren't sharing information effectively, and ultimately we weren't really taking advantage of the knowledge we had, or we were repeating the same research over and over. So originally, actually just sort of pitched it as something internally, and they said, this sounds like a product on its own. I let that simmer, and I was like, yes, it should be a product on its own. So started bootstrapping. They said, you can stick around. They were really cool as well. They said, stick around, build it. When you're ready, then you can get going. I think I lasted a couple of months where then eventually I just sort of felt I wasn't doing Hotjar justice being there, because my mind was totally being consumed by Avrio.
Yeah.
And bootstrap for the start, and actually funnily ended up raising capital, but not wanting to raise capital in the beginning. I decided I wanted to bootstrap this company, but because I also have a podcast, Chen FM, I was interviewing guests, and I was using the guests as a way to collect feedback of what we were doing and what we were building. And I was just hearing from them oh, this is really interesting. Are you raising any capital? And the answer was no. And they're like, well, when you're ready, we would be interested to invest. And I heard that 5-6 times, and I was like, okay, well, maybe it's worth just seeing what's out there and if it is interesting.
Yeah.
And we actually ended up closing around in about a week, and 6 of the 7 investors that we have were guests on the show. We raised from 1 VC and then 6 different angels. So yeah, that's where we are today.
Fantastic. So would you say there's anything you would change about your approach if you had to do it all over again?
Change it if I approach all over again. Today, I would say no. Maybe if you ask me in 2-3 years time from now, I might have a different answer.
Yeah.
I think this was very deliberate, the path as well that's been taken. So I mentioned Chen FM being the podcast. I started that podcast over 3 years ago. And the original reason for starting the podcast was I wanted to start a new business, but I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do yet. So I started building an audience. So when I was ready, I could then start and use that audience as a platform to launch the product. So like there's been a lot of serendipitous things that have happened as a result. So like the fundraising being one, meeting customers and stuff, another, like the network that's been built now as a result. And like I basically have 180 different mentors that I can reach out to at any point with different challenges and struggles we're having. So I think from that component, it's been a great and smoothish experience. Obviously, startups up and down, like made loads of mistakes on the product side. Like I think you hear these stories all the time. So like when we first launched, like we had a lot of interest, but activation and usage was absolute crap. But through iteration, through speaking to customers, like I think that's just like the normal ebbs and flows of launching a startup.
That's a pretty smart way to approach it, though, as far as building the audience from the ground up rather than sort of a product. So, I mean, most people usually do it the other way around. So I'm sure that you're glad that you did it that way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So with Avrio, how did you get your first 10 customers? Was it pretty much from the podcast?
Yeah, so podcast definitely helped a lot in the beginning to get some of the early adopters on board. And then like for us, I mean, we first launched on Product Hunt itself. And the first month we actually had around 500 to 700 signups, and we had some really good brands, so like Adidas, Envision. It was nice, but then nobody used the product, the first version of it at least. So we knew then at that stage that like the messaging and the positioning of the product was resonating with people. It was just we weren't delivering on the value end from the product perspective. So we had to like take a step back and work with that. But from that, we were lucky that we did have like an existing audience that we could tap into when we did start charging for the product. And yeah.
Absolutely. All right, so let's switch gears a bit and talk a little bit about the actual Avrio product. You know, what it is, what it does, and I guess what sets it apart from the competition.
Yeah. So essentially what we do at Avrio is we help teams collaborate more effectively on research, and we provide tools for analysis and more effective ways to share it. So a big component of how companies use our product today is a lot of teams are doing user research. They're speaking to customers all the time. So with our product, you can actually upload your existing user interviews into our platform. We automatically transcribe them for you. We also use machine learning to do things like automatic question detection, which is a very typical time-consuming process that researchers will do. They'll try to find the question, they'll pull out the text, they'll throw it in a table, they'll then cross-analyze. So what we are working towards is really automating away a lot of these manual processes that we do for synthesis as research through Avrio. So that's one component of the product. You can also then create and share highlights with your team very easily by just selecting parts of the transcript, and then that automatically creates short clips. Because a lot of times in fast-moving organizations, people are not going to watch an hour-long interview, but you can really capture those key moments where your customers are giving you insights and share those more effectively. And then we give you a way to build reports and to create a curated library of research where your team can come to and consume all the knowledge that you have throughout the organization. And finally, like a really interesting component of our product is our browser extension, which essentially allows you to save information from a various different tools. So if you're in a Mixpanel or Hotjar or different platform, you can actually then bring together some qualitative and quantitative data into a single report more effectively and save that information in context. So your team can actually view the reports on your homepage if you've done some research on your homepage, and we give you new ways for discovery.
Yeah. So would it be able to identify repeated patterns and correlations from the information that you're receiving?
Yes. So this is where we're working towards now as well as a product, is that the first stage was like saying, okay, can we get this right with a single user interview? Can we like identify questions effectively? Can we provide good summaries? And I would say like we are probably 88% where we want to be at the stage from that perspective. And then the next iteration of the product is really going to take a look, okay, how can we quantify information across all the interviews that you're doing? Look for similar questions that have been asked across interviews and provide summaries to that similar question. And this is some of the R&D work that we're doing at the moment, and will be coming into the product pretty soon as well.
Nice. Very interesting. Okay, so based on that, how can business owners identify the ideal customer profile and build a lead scoring model to target the right people at the right time?
This is a fully loaded question, and we don't have enough time for it. But I can give you just like a very, very high level
Just an
way that,
overview. Yeah.
that we've done and seen effective in the past. So I think when looking to identify who your ideal customer profile is, there's typically 4 buckets or segments of users that you want to be looking at to try and identify who these people are. So typically, when we identify ideal customer profile, most people look to their existing customer base, and then they say, okay, what is the firmographic properties and what are the demographic properties that they make up? Like, how big are these businesses? How much revenue do they do? What is the role of this individual? And I'm talking in context of a B2B space.
Yeah.
But more often than not, like the customers that you have today are a direct result of the marketing that you've done up until now and the product that you've built. They don't necessarily represent the best opportunity for your business going forward and the way that the market is moving. So what we typically would do is we would start with a panel study. We would look, okay, new audience, like present our product to that audience, and we would want to look at like what is the willingness to pay and their likelihood to buy, which would give us an indication of, okay, are there certain segments in the market that our product maybe resonates better with, but we're just not reaching them effectively through our marketing at this stage. The second thing that you'll want to look at then is recently converted users. So who is marketing speaking to today? What percentage and demographic? And each time I talk about these, we'll typically have like standard demographic and firmographic properties, which we're dissecting by. We'd say, okay, there was 1,000 signups in June. 25% were single owner, one small business owners. 35 were like 2 to 50 people in the organization and so forth. And you do this with various properties that you could then map. And there are tools like Clearbit and others that allow you to enrich your database. So you can collect some of this information, or you can be collecting this information at sign up. Different companies do different ways. And then you'd want to see what is the conversion rates to customers as well. So you would potentially take a cohort that signed up in 6 months ago, and then you look today and see of that cohort, how many ended up converting, and what did their demographic properties like? Are there maybe a specific industry that converts way better than another industry, and you're just not reaching them effectively, or you need to be acquiring more of them? And then finally, looking at retention, it's like, let's take a cohort of users that have been with us for longer than 12 months, that have been paying X amount and show good usage, and what do their properties look like? And once you have these 4 different buckets of users, you can slowly, hopefully, start to see patterns between maybe different properties. There might be, as I said, a specific industry that really stands out across like conversion, retention, and so forth. And that allows you then to build essentially a model where you can give scores based on, if it's the industry, you can say like the top one gets 3 points, the second one gets 2 points, and the fourth 3 points, 1 point, sorry. And then essentially you can then build a model like that using all your firmographic and demographic properties, which should give you an indication of what a good model would look like and who the ideal customer profile is.
Excellent. Very useful. All right. So what would you say about some businesses that are making mistakes with data analysis and UX research?
Yeah, I think this is a very common thing. So, I mean, there's tons of different mistakes that people are making with data analysis and UX research. And again, like this could be a whole podcast, not even an episode.
Yes, agree.
But I think for me, at least one of the things I see is like one of the biggest mistakes organizations make still today is how separate and disjointed data analytics and user research typically is. And you'd always find like data analytics on one side, typically a lot more heavily invested, bigger budgets. And then you'd have UX team and UX research or user researcher, maybe a lot of times a sole user researcher in the organization, limited budgets. And these teams don't effectively work together. And they can be getting a lot more out of the work that they do by really combining the qualitative and quantitative aspects of their roles. And because a lot of times you'll see something in data and you'll say, oh, wow, this is very interesting, but you have no clue what's going on there because data is telling you what's happening. It's not telling you why it's happening.
Yes.
And on the inverse, from user research, you speak to a handful of customers, like 10 customers, 20 if you're lucky,
Yeah.
in a study, and then you're making decisions based on that. But it's difficult to quantify how big an issue is that you're hearing. So you might hear a certain pattern, and then you can go back to your data team and say, hey, I'm hearing the product's being used in this way. Like, can you tell me, are there other users that are experiencing this, and how big of an audience is this? So really having the two working closely together, they can feed ideas to one another, and then they can take more advantage of the work and the collective research that they do.
Yeah, you can't really get accurate insights just by using one or the other. It's got to be both, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, like, I think the other thing with data is everybody always like obsesses of having the perfect data, but I
Yeah.
think that's also just another thing I've realized through my career. There is no such thing, and we mostly should be using these for signals rather than like 100% this is the truth and you need to be going in this direction. Like, there is always room and margin for errors in the data that we do have today, no matter what we think and how well our setup is. And yeah.
And you don't really need millions of records either, do you? I mean, a few hundred records, you should be able to get some decent information from that.
Yeah. And I think that's also one of the things is like early stage companies tend to like focus a lot on data and less on user research, where at an early stage, like your data is just really noise because you don't have the volumes to get to statistical significance.
Yes.
So it should really be treated as just a signal of what's happening. And then you really need to be speaking to customers and digging into their pain points and understanding what needs to change.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so maybe let's talk a little bit about the podcast that you started up, which has raised quite a bit of money. And yeah, who are you talking to on that show?
Yeah, so Chen FM is really, it started out as a podcast, as I mentioned, wanting to build something, wasn't sure what I wanted to do yet. And we really focus, as the name suggests, on churn and retention in SaaS and subscription businesses. And so we've been fortunate to speak to some of the world's fastest growing companies. So we've had like great guests from growth, like Julian Caban and Brian Belfour on that side. We've had some really great leaders in customer success. Actually, funny enough, at some point, like Chen FM was rated the #1 customer success podcast, which we don't focus on it as such, but because it tends to gravitate a lot of like the discussions and talk around churn retention there, that ended up being a happy accident. But we've had like some amazing guests. We've also even like branched out. One of our episodes, I interviewed the Miami mayor, Francis Suarez, on his plans to retain all the talent that was flocking to Miami at some point post-COVID. So the focus really is around like churn and retention, how companies are battling it most effectively. And some people ask me, like, after 180 episodes, how much more is there on that specific topic? But you'd be surprised. And this is one of the things I say, is that like churn and retention is the output metric, and there's just so many different inputs that like impact that metric that it's easy to go into a different topic each time. And how does website copy influence what people see, and the positioning? And then you'd say, okay, sales, how does sales influence churn retention? Are they selling to the wrong leads and end up like closing wrong fit customers? Like every role in the organization has some influence, whether they know it yet or not. So that's what we do with the show, is just uncover all those different nuances and show people that there's more than one way to really focus and approach the problem.
Okay, so is it just interviews, or is it some of the episodes yourself just sort of giving lessons?
No, it's just interviews, itself at the moment. Yeah. So I'm actually planning on using my product to write a book and compile the knowledge from all the guests, because with Avrio, we automatically translate, we automatically detect questions that have been asked, which is perfect for the podcast style. And then combining similar questions, I can then group like all of this knowledge from the guests into I would say at this stage, like there's some really great content in there that could be compiled. So
that's an excellent idea. So what, you're doing about one podcast a week, or what's the volume approximately?
Yeah, so a new episode every single Wednesday since we launched.
Wednesday,
and I mean, that's about it. Like, I think consistency, it's important, but I think just as much as consistency, like quality, is also really key.
Fair enough. So from the podcast, what would you say the fastest growing companies, how are they using retention to fuel their growth?
Again, this question is like 180 episodes worth. But I would say like I'd summarize like the key thing I think the best companies do when it comes to churn retention is they have a really, really strong alignment within the organization, and they understand that it's not a single team's metric. It really is a company metric in a SaaS business. Ultimately, if your customers are canceling the subscriptions in a subscription business, you don't really have a business if that continues to happen. So it's not an individual team's problem. It's really the company's problem. And they have really strong alignment, and they understand their influence within the organization of how they can work towards it. And they all work and row in the same direction. So it's not that they have competing goals when it comes to acquisition that could maybe force marketing to bring in the wrong types of customers and drop the quality and in leads. And like there's a whole myriad of different actions that can happen when we have competing goals. But really the best companies have really strong alignment and understand the influence.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, so from your observation, what would you say is the biggest challenge that most entrepreneurs are experiencing with growing SaaS companies at the moment?
Single biggest challenge.
Or most common challenge,
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have a good answer for this at this stage. Like, I don't know if there's a single biggest challenge. I think it will all depend on your background, your experience, your expertise, your network, what the challenges that you're going to be facing, because it will depend the experience that you're coming with and how you approach it. So if I look at like the first time I started a company to now I started a company, my challenges are like two totally different challenges. I think like when you're first getting started, you have the benefit of being naive and like not being intimidated or just like running with it and figuring things out as you go. As you have experience, you tend to sort of have a little bit better focus and realize, okay, these are the things that really, really matter. But I would say I probably don't speak to enough entrepreneurs like starting businesses out now. So most of the companies that I also speak to typically tend to be like past Series A. They've got a level of product market fit. And those challenges growing there are different to like challenges getting started. So
yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. Fair enough. So have you got a favorite business book?
Favorite business book? And there's quite a few books, and I'll have to lean back and take a look. So my favorites, there's a few different ones for different reasons. So like I really love the book Hooked by Nuriel, who's been a guest on the podcast as well. Really around like how to build product forming habits. The other one I have on the shelf is like Start With Why, Simon Sinek. I think it's really great from a leadership perspective. 0 to 1, Peter Thiel. I really enjoyed that. The Hard Things About Hard Things, Ben Horowitz. I loved that. And yeah, there's quite a lot of books. Maybe one of the more recent ones, less like focused from a business perspective, but was, I'm losing the name now. We'll leave that one out. If I remember, I'll let you know, and you can add it to the show notes. But I mean, reading is like super critical. So always trying to find new things. And actually, part of my show, what I do is I ask the guests like, what is the book that you're currently reading right now? And then when I see like a few guests mention the same book, like that sort of creeps up the ladder and ends up driving onto my book list. So
yeah, that's pretty much the same reason why I asked the question as well. But interesting.
So then I'll definitely have to find the title that I was talking about as well.
So what would you say you're curious about right now or researching regarding SaaS and software?
And I think
topic.
As a topic, I think like it's interesting a few different things are interesting. So one is some recent work actually by Eleanor Werner, who's going to be joining myself on the podcast, around the idea of a reverse trial. And so I think she might be the first person to have crowned it this name. I'm not too sure, but this is something that we actually had at Hotjar, and we used to call it like a hybrid experience, where you have your freemium model, where is essentially a freemium, like you can come in, use the products, and then there's certain caps or limits that you need to hit, and you start paying when you need to pay.
Yeah.
There's a trial version, which is essentially so, and on the freemium, typically you would like gate certain features and things like that that you need to upgrade for. On the trial, you would give the features and you would give the experience for a time period, and after the time period, you need to pay. And then what we actually used to do as well was like you would start the trial, and then if you didn't pay, you would go to freemium again. So it was like a reverse trial in a sense where, and I think this is like probably something we would see more of a common habits, like now that it's being discussed and people are like got a label for it, a little bit more common. So I'm interested to see like how many businesses start taking this approach, and what is the impact over time for this. Like myself, actually, we were discussing this internally with the team, is that we have a freemium model where you can come in, get started, and then you start paying when you hit certain limits. But we do limit the product quite a bit in that sense, so people perhaps are not getting the best value out of it, and we're looking at perhaps testing it ourselves. So I think that's an interesting area in SaaS and software. That's there's always like a lot of interesting things happening in pricing and packaging, but I think it's going to be interesting to hear some of the stories coming out of people now that there's a label that's been given to it, that we can actually start talking about it a little bit more and seeing what that's like.
Yeah, I'd never actually heard of that before, but now that you mention it, sort of logically it makes sense, because once people are using something and enjoying it, they don't want to lose it. So
it's the loss aversion, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Perfect. All right, so just to wrap up, where can people go to find out more about Avrio and your podcast?
Yeah, so for both, I mean, website's probably the best place for both of them. So Avrio's avrio.com. And the website Chen FM is churn.fm is the domain. And both sites obviously have all the information you do. With Avrio, we have a free trial, a freemium option. So you can get started using the product for free, give it a test, and then see like as your needs grow into it. And likewise with Chen FM, I mean, if you're listening to the show and you have great stories to share about churn retention, we're always looking for new inspiration. So I'd love to hear from anybody. And myself personally, I'm available on LinkedIn or Twitter, and always happy to connect and chat about other topic.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Thanks for coming on the show, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Scott. It was great being here.